Hey everybody, I want to show you all of the details on the construction on Princess Lola Socks. And I'm going to go over them on an actual finished sock so you understand the whole construction. And then on my needles, I'll show you a few things that I think will be really helpful to see me do. But know that there are links in the pattern for how to do Judy's Magic Cast On and how to do German short rows and anything else that you're not as comfortable with. There's also individual links in the pattern as well. But I think this video is going to be helpful for those of you who have never knit a toe-up sock before. So Princess Lola socks are toe-up socks. So you're starting right down here at the toe and starting to work around. What is fun about Princess Lola socks is I gave you guys what is called a princess sole. So the purl bump is to the outside and the knit stitch is to the inside of the sock. And that's so you don't feel those little bumps on the bottom of your foot. I guess some people are sensitive about socks, and it makes sense that Lola's feet would be very sensitive and that she would definitely need princess socks. So you can see on this sock right here that I cast on right here, and I worked increases on every other round as I went around to create the shape of that toe right there. You can see it a little better if I hold it out like that. So there's increases happening every other row. It's really easy to keep track of where you are because you have knit stitches on the instep, right? And then you have purl stitches on the sole. So keeping track of where you are in this pattern once you understand the construction, I think is pretty easy. And then you work straight for a while after you're done with your toe increases, and you work until the gusset point. And the pattern tells you how to do the math so that the foot is the length that you need it to be for you. And you'll work up to that point right there, just working around and around and around. That's pretty fast. And then you start to do this really pretty decorative gusset increase. So what happens is that over here and on this other side over here, you're adding a stitch on every other row. So you're ending up with more and more stitches on your needles. So at one point, it's like right around here, you end up with a lot of stitches on your needles. If I grab my pattern for a second, I could actually show you guys. I know you guys can hear that paper. So when you have the most stitches on your needles, you'll have 88 for the small and 94 for the larger size going around because you've done these increases. And this decorative increase is just done with a yarn over and a decrease and a yarn over on each side. So typically when you do an increase on a sock, you've probably just done one increase, but I was being adorable by doing a yarn over and then a decrease and a yarn over, so you get that lovely little line going up right there. And then once you get to the width right there, so it's like that widest part of your foot where kind of comes around the top of your foot and then around your heel again, you do a heel turn right here, and you use German short rows on that. So you do this little heel turn, and then it's time to work the heel flap. And the heel flap, you're just working back and forth across those heel stitches and basically binding off a stitch from each side. So those stitches that you increased for the gusset, you're decreasing again for the heel flap. And then when you get up to here and you've decreased down all of those stitches and you're to your original stitch count again, you work a few short rows right here. And that's because I find with peds that sometimes they fall down into your shoe a little bit back in the heel, and I wanted these beads to be up and away from your shoe. So you work a little short rows just to kind of build up in this area a little bit. And then you work this fun little cuff, and it's got this kind of almost little crown stitch with a bead in it. Using that bead is optional. You definitely don't have to use that bead. And you work that around and then you bind off. If you have a wider foot, you'll find that you want to use a more elastic bind off than somebody who doesn't have as wide a foot. So I noticed with my daughter Bella, when I made these for hers, when I used a traditional really elastic bind off, it was baggy because her ankle is a little more narrow even though her foot is wide. So I changed the bind off to make it a little bit tighter and not quite as elastic so that it would still look really pretty on her foot when it was done. So that is the construction of the Princess Lola sock from the toe all the way up to the cuff. Now let me show you a few things that I think will be helpful for you to see. Okay, I am starting at the toe, and I'm going to quickly show you Judy's Magic Cast on double pointed needles. If you haven't worked this before, there is a video link that will go more in depth into this. So if this is too quick for you, definitely watch that other one and do a little studying on your own. I'm working on double pointed needles. You can also work on 1 or 2 long circular needles. That is up to you. I tend to knit socks really tight, and all of my long circular needles, I've bent the needle tips on them, so I'm down to double pointed needles for size 0 needles. So I have the yarn going over the back needle of my 2 needles held parallel to each other, and then I'm making a cross with that yarn. So I'm going to take the yarn going off the back needle, and I'm going to go over the front needle, and then I'm going to take the yarn coming off the thumb, and I'm going to go over the back needle. And I'm going to do that. You're going to do that for this pattern until you have 10 stitches on each needle for 20 stitches total. I'm just going to do it for 5 stitches because you don't need to watch me knit that many stitches as I'm doing this little tiny sock sample. And then you kind of twist your yarn underneath there to make things easier to work. And I am going to zoom back in now. Fancy, you guys. And now I'm going to come in and I'm going to work a knit all the way around on this first round. So if you're working on double pointed needles like I am, you end up having to kind of twist that top needle just a little bit so that you can get into your stitch. Let me see if I can get that focused again. There we go. So you can see I kind of have to rotate the needle a little bit to get it in there, and I'll be able to tighten up that first stitch. So I'm just going to knit across those 5. Sometimes it takes a time or two to get Jenny's Magic Cast On started. Let's make sure I'm in there. There's my 5th stitch. So there, I worked across the first 5, and now I'm going to just turn my work, and I'm going to slide that needle back in like that. And now I am going to knit across those 5 stitches. There you go. Hopefully you all can see that. All right, so that was round 1. I know it was a little awkward and I didn't talk for a second or 2 there. So now I'm turning my work again, and basically these top 5 stitches are going to be my instep, and then these bottom 5 stitches are going to be my sole. And on this row, I'm going to knit those 5, round. I'm going to knit those 5, and I'm going to purl those 5. And then you're going to know really easily whether you're on the top or the bottom of the foot once you have this row set up. So now I am knitting 5 on the top. You're knitting 10, remember. I'm just going smaller. I don't want to bore you with my videos. I just want them to be helpful. There we go. And now I am going to purl 5 on the bottom here, and I'll be back at the beginning of the round. Now, if you want, you can mark the beginning of the round with a removable stitch marker into the fabric. If you're working with double pointed needles, it doesn't really work. And even circular needles, when you're working in the round like this, it doesn't work so well to put a stitch marker onto the needle because it just flies right off again. So you can see now you have this kind of, that's the very toe of the sock right there, and this is going to be the sole, and that is the instep. Pretty cool. So now I am working the increase round, which I believe is round 3. And I'm going to knit 1, and then I'm going to make 1 right. Let's make sure you can see that. I find sometimes when I'm shooting videos I forget to breathe. And now I'm going to make 1 left. So I'm going to pick up that bar in between the stitches. These are written out in the abbreviations if you've never worked a make 1 right or make 1 left before. It's such a catch-22 with these videos because those of you who've been knitting for a while, you would be really bored if I showed every single style of increase. But those of you who haven't knit as much, getting those broken down for you is really nice. So I try to strike a balance. So now we're on the purl side of the increase round, and these I want to show you a little more closely because you might not have worked a make one right purl or make one left purl before, and I'll be able to go over the concept. So that first stitch I'm just going to purl, and that second stitch is a make one right purl. When I think make one right, you were wanting to come into the back of the bar in between the stitches with the left hand needle. Sometimes what I do is I end up lifting it up with the right hand needle. So I've lifted that up, and the way I remember the back and right is I'll be right back, right? So I've got the left needle going into the back of that bar, and then I am going to purl that stitch right there. So that's a make one right purl. And now I'm purling 3. Okay, and now I'm going to make one left purl. And to make one left, you've got that bar in between the stitches, and with your left needle tip, you go into it from the front to the back. The way I've heard that as a good memory for that is I left the front door open. Right, so you go in from the front to the back, and now I'm going to purl that stitch, and I know it's a little awkward, so sorry if I'm getting out of focus while I see that. Okay, so there we go, going into that. It gets easier to do this once you have a few more stitches on the needles. And now I've increased 2 stitches on that top needle and 2 stitches on the bottom needle. At this point, if you're working on double pointed needles, you might decide to introduce some more needles, and it'll make things a little easier. So I'm going to do this on this round for you. This is just a plain round where I'm knitting the knit stitches and purling the purl stitches. And what I'm going to do is knit 4 and then grab a new needle and knit 3. There you go. And now I'm on the sole, and you can see I'm just starting to work in the round here, and I'm going to purl all of these stitches. So you're going to continue on working rounds 1 and round 2 until your sock is the correct width for your foot. Remember, when you're choosing a size for this pattern, to choose a size that's about a ½ inch smaller than your foot. You want your sock to be a little tighter than your foot. I make the smaller size for myself, and I'm about like I'm in between like a 6.5 and a 7.5, kind of depends on the shoe for my foot. And my daughter Bella wears the larger size, and she's got like a 8.5 foot, and her foot's a little definitely wider than mine. So that might be a good indicator for you to know which size to choose if you're making these as a gift for a friend. So continue around and then get up to the gusset increase points, and I'm going to show you what to do there. Okay, let's work the gusset together. I have many fewer stitches on my needles than you will have on yours at this point. I just want to go over the concept with you. So I'm on page 3, and I'm starting with the gusset, and I'm working the setup round, which you'll see says to work in pattern to the last stitch of the round, to 1 stitch before the end of the round. And this is the new start of round right here. So what I'm going to do, because I need 1 more needle, is just take that last stitch that is now the first stitch of the round and put it on to the first needle, right? That was the first stitch of the round, and now that's the new first stitch of the round. So I got my yarn back there. Remember, your inset stitches are your knit stitches, and your purl stitches are your sole stitches. That's really the biggest trick to this pattern if you get confused about where you're at. All right, so now I'm gonna work as it is written, and it says for round 1 to slip, slip, knit, and yarn over and knit to 1 stitch before the end of instep. So I'm going to slip, slip, knit, and then I'm going to yarn over. Just make sure you can see that. And now I'm knitting to the end of the instep, which means, guys, knitting to 1 stitch before the end of the instep, sorry. So I'm knitting right here. Let's make sure that's focused. I think right there's focused. Okay. Get to 1 stitch before the end of the instep. And I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to knit 2 together. You're going to notice that this first knit 2 together actually takes that purl stitch right there from the sole. So I've got to yarn over, and I had to do a little finagling to do that knit 2 together right there. Things get easier, right? And then, let's see what the pattern says there. It says to place a marker, and that this is the new end of the instep. So I'm going to place a marker right there, and then yarn over and purl to the end of the round. So those purl stitches are still your sole stitches. Now remember, I am working on double pointed needles. Your stitches might be set up a little differently on your needles if you are working on 1 or 2 circular needles. One thing that I don't like doing in sock patterns is telling you which needle should have what stitches on it, because you might find a way that works for you, and I don't think it's a good idea to dictate that. So, oh, I see what happened there. I think my yarn over jumped off my needle, so my marker fell off, and it will get locked in place in a second on that next row. Okay, so that was round 1. Round 2, we're going to be knitting across the instep and then purling the sole stitches, and the yarn overs always get knit. So you're always going to be knitting the increased stitches. I think I forgot to do the last stitch of the round, which is the yarn over. And I am actually not going to put that on the needle with the sole stitches. I am going to put that right there, and I'm going to run and grab a stitch marker to mark the end of the round. There we go. So now I've got my end of the round marked. Sorry about that. And now I'm working round 2. I'm sorry if I confused you guys on that. So I'm basically knitting the knits and purling the purls, and at the same time when I hit a yarn over, I am going to be knitting those, not purling them. Okay, so there's a yarn over, there's that, this was the knit 2 together. Just slip that marker, and I'm knitting that stitch. That stitch right there becomes the first stitch of the gusset on that side of the foot. And now I am purling across my sole stitches. There we go. And now I just have that one last stitch to end that round, and that is going to be a knit stitch because it was that yarn over I made at the very end of the round, and that is the gusset on the other side of the sock. Sorry about that little stinky marker. Okay, so now guys, we are on round 3. And once you get round 3, you're kind of good to go. I'm going to just show it to you because I think it really helps to understand what's happening with these gussets. So I'm going to slip, slip, knit, yarn over, and now I am knitting to the last 2 stitches of the instep, and that is going to be 2 stitches before that marker. You place that marker to help you know where the instep is. Some of you might find you don't need the markers on this pattern, so you don't need to use them if you don't need them. We just felt like it was important to put them in there for people to give you a little reminder of where you're at. So your instep stitches aren't changing at all, right? Because I'm getting to 2 stitches before the end of this instep. I'm doing a yarn over and a knit 2 together. So an increase and a decrease. And now I'm doing a yarn over, and it says knit to heel stitches, right? Which is the, I should say sole stitches. That's funny. Okay, so you're going to knit to the sole stitches. And now I'm going to purl across all of those sole stitches. Okay, and now I am going to, sorry, I have to read my pattern. Now I'm going to knit that stitch because it says knit to end of round, but I only have 1 knit stitch so far. And then I'm going to make a yarn over. So my gusset stitches are right there, and my instep stitches, that's that top of the foot stitches. I'm just knitting across those. So now I'm on round 4, and I'm basically knitting all the instep stitches, knitting all the gusset stitches, and purling the sole stitches. So that is how you work the gusset. You'll just continue on repeating rounds 3 and 4 until you have the correct number of gusset stitches, and I've given you that number. Remember that you knit those increased gusset stitches. All right, just keep going around. I am going to work a very small gusset, and then we will look at turning the heel, okay? All right, it is time for us to turn the heel. So we're going to set up for working the heel on the sole stitches. So you'll notice on turning the heel that now it says row instead of round. And that's because we're going to be working back and forth just on the sole stitches for working the heel. And that first row says to knit across the instep, which you know how to do, and knit the first gusset stitches, and then purl to the end of the heel. And I'm almost to the end of the heel right now. I decided to wait and show you that together. So I'm just purling to the end of the heel, and then I'm going to turn my work. So I'm going to be looking at the wrong side of the work, which remember is going to look like knit stitches right now because I've got that reverse stockinette stitch sole, right? And now I'm going to slip one purlwise with yarn in front. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the front of my work. I'm going to slip that stitch, and I'm going to bring the yarn up and over the needle. And you'll see what that does is creates this kind of double stitch right there because I'm pulling up the stitch up and over the needle. And now I'm going to knit to the end of the heel. Your pattern will give you an exact stitch count to work, but basically what you're doing is purling to the end. Sorry, that was a twisted stitch, so I'm just going to fix that. That was from me ripping back earlier, which you guys did not see. So now I am knitting to the end of the heel, and I am turning again. And now I'm going to slip one purlwise with yarn in front, so I'm going to bring the yarn to front of my work. slip that stitch purlwise. And again, I'm going to bring that yarn up and over the needle, creating that double stitch. Then I'm going to bring it back to the front of my work because I'm going to purl all the way across to that double stitch that I just made on the other end of the row. So I am purling across and I'm to that double stitch, and I'm going to turn my work, bring my yarn to the front of my work, and now I am going to slip that stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, bring the yarn up and over the needle to the back, and now I am knitting across to the double stitch on this side. Not hard, right? I love turning heels. It's kind of like this magical moment where you're creating shaping in this big tube that you have. When I was designing these, I remembered how much I love knitting toe-up socks. I think I like knitting toe-up socks maybe a tiny bit more than top-down socks, and I hadn't designed any in a while. So now I'm back to that double stitch, and I'm going to turn my work again. And you will see that your pattern says to continue working in this way until you have 9 double stitches on one side and 8 on the other. So you can see I've got, now I've got 2 wrapped on this side and I've got 2 wrapped over here. So I'm going to go on to the heel flap right now. I'm just going to give you like a tiny little turned heel. You'll follow the pattern as it is written. So right now I am working row 1 of the heel flap, and I did that slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, so I've got an even number of double wraps on each side of the heel. And now I'm going to start knitting. So one of my testers, when she was working this pattern, got a little confused about this, but you definitely want to read row 1, which is the right side row of the heel flap, and follow it exactly as you're written, because you're not on the sole of the foot anymore once you've worked that heel flap, and you're going to be knitting across these stitches, not purling anymore. So that is not a typo in the pattern, but a few of you might run into that and be like, what the what? So I'm knitting across, and it says to knit 18 or 19, working the double stitches as if one. So I'm coming to this double stitch right here, and I'm going to work that as one stitch. And now this next double stitch, I'm going to treat it as one stitch and work a slip, slip, knit. And that slip and slip knit is going to be happening with the last stitch of the heel and the first stitch of the gusset. So I'm going to have to go get that second stitch of the slip slip knit from over on the next needle. And now I'm going to work those 2 stitches together. And that double wrap is in there as well. So that's like a tiny bit of a funky moment, but you can see that I worked that slip slip knit right there. And that is row 1 of the heel flap. What the heel flap is doing is starting to decrease off your gusset stitches on each side. So those are those stitches on either side of the marker right there. You're starting to eat them up to build up the heel flap. So now I'm on row 2, and I'm going to slip 1 purlwise with the yarn in front. And now I'm purling now. I'm not wrapping any stitches anymore. And creating that double stitch. I am going to purl across, and then I'm going to work a purl 2 together with the last stitch of the heel with the first stitch of the gusset. And again, when I get to the double stitches, you're going to work them as one stitch right there. So I'm just picking up both of those and working it together. And now I get to this next one, and I want to purl that together with the first stitch of the gusset over here. So I'm just going to take that, I want to make sure you can see it, and I'm going to move those over right there, and I am going to, sorry about the lighting issue there you guys, purl those 2 stitches together. And now I am on row 3 of the heel flap, and rows 3 and 4 you'll be repeating. So if I show you row 3 and 4 once, you are really good to go on the rest of the sock. You've got everything else in the pattern you need to know. So I'm going to slip one purlwise with yarn and back, and then I'm going to knit one, and I'm going to do that across. And then I end with a slip one purlwise right there. And now I'm going to do an SSK where I am building together decreasing off a gusset stitch, right, by working the last stitch right there with a gusset stitch. So I'm just moving that over to that needle to make it easier to do. And then I'm going to slip, slip, knit. Okay, and now I'm going to have that stitch on my needle, and when you'll see on row 4, that's actually a slip stitch. So I don't even have to work it. It's already been slipped onto that needle, which is pretty slick. And now I'm going to purl across to the last stitch. Let's make sure you can see me. Purling across here to the last stitch. And now I am going to purl 2 together. So I'm going to take this stitch and purl it together with that stitch right there. There you have it. So that is rows 3 and 4. And you're going to continue to work those 12 or 13 more times for the size that you're making. And then you will have decreased down your stitches, and you will be ready to work the cuff and everything else you need to work to finish your Princess Lola socks. We have a Cal in the Ravelry group, so definitely come join me if you have any questions. I am more than happy to help you. Happy knitting.